Wow, February really just ends, doesn't it? I wasn't planning on making this video for, I thought, ages. I had like 2 or 3 videos left to make this month before I got to my monthly wrap-up, but then I checked my calendar, turns out we're at the end of the month. February isn't even a thing, but I love doing my monthly wrap-ups and I wasn't going to skip it, so here we are. Here's everything I read in February, which it turns out has already happened. Who knew? I made a video kind of kicking off this year about how I just want to read fantasy and sci-fi right now because I need good escapism. I want to read the stuff that I grew up on. I want to rediscover my love of fiction. And I didn't realize how much I have missed fantasy fiction. It has been more fun than I can put into words, reading book after book after book, set in expansive fantasy worlds with big adventures, deep lore. Oh, it's been so wonderful. It's been so good for my brain just reading fantasy and sci-fi. So with one exception, everything I read in February is fantasy, science fiction, or comic books. But before we jump into it, I want to be really earnest for a second. If you've been enjoying my videos recently and you've got $1 to spare every month, I would really appreciate your support over on Patreon. It's hard to talk about this stuff as a creator, honestly, for obvious reasons, but Patreon makes up the bulk of my income. And Patreon is something that ebbs and flows. You gain patrons, you lose patrons, it's just how it happens. Because every patron is a human being with a life of their own. But recently I've been losing more than I've been gaining, so if you love my content, if you tune in and watch me and enjoy what I do, and you've got $1 a month that you can spare and throw my way, you can join a wonderful intersectional community of bookworms. And you'll be helping me pay my bills and keep my channel going. I would really appreciate your support. Thank you. Now let's crack on with what I read this month. We're going to start with the last thing that I read in February, which might also be the best thing that I read in February. This is a fantasy novel that I'm kind of paranoid is going to fly under the radar for so many people. But I have such a personal investment in getting this book into the hands of as many fantasy readers as possible that it will be coming up in a lot of videos in the future. This is the brand new novel by Richard Swan, Grave Empire. Now, I've been familiar with Richard Swan for a few years. He wrote a trilogy not long ago that started with something called The Justice of Kings. It caught my eye, but I wasn't in a fantasy mood at the time, so I didn't read it. This book, Grave Empire, is the first in a new trilogy set in the same world hundreds of years later. And Grave Empire honestly feels like it was made for me. This is Game of Thrones meets Pirates of the Caribbean. Although I guess that comparison actually works better for the Live Ship Traders series by Robin Hobb, but Grave Empire is set in a totally fantastical world, but the time period that it's set in is very reminiscent of the early 18th century, a time when the British, Dutch, and Spanish empires were taking over the world, a time of pirates, a time of colonialism and warfare, and this book captures that setting in so many different ways, including exploring the evils of colonialism. But it plays on the evils of colonialism in such a fun and frenetic way. There are mermen in this book. There are multiple nations at war with each other, and this is one of the few fantasy books where you will actually turn back to the map at the beginning and consult it constantly, because the geography of this world plays a really key role. There's lots of traveling, lots of adventure, lots of international politics. There are battles and wars being waged. There are new places being explored. There is diplomacy. There is plague. There is so much political intrigue. I'm going to talk about this book a lot more in an upcoming video, so brace yourself for that because I am obsessed. Next up is a Japanese thriller that has taken over the world, and I'm really happy about that. This is Strange Pictures by an anonymous author named Uketsu, who has a really huge YouTube channel. On that channel, Uketsu mostly posts really surreal stuff. One of the videos that he made back in 2020 inspired this book, a collection of 4 interconnected stories that focus around pictures that have been hand-drawn by the characters characters in those stories. The pictures factor into figuring out the mystery. As I said, this is a thriller. Did I say that? I think I said that. The stories in here feature mysteries that need to be solved. I've done a full video on it, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but I am so amazed by the breadth and scope of this thing. The fact that these stories are each self-contained, individual, independent mystery tales, but they're also interconnected with each other. You basically get 3 independent stories, each one focusing around a picture or even a handful of pictures. There is often death, and sometimes that death is quite gruesome. And then the 4th story kind of wraps everything up together. It is so clever. It is so twisted. It's pretty dark. But if you love weird Japanese fiction, if you love thrillers and murder mysteries, if you love puzzles, this is absolutely for you. Shroud is the brand new science fiction novel by the king of science fiction, Adrian Tchaikovsky. I love Tchaikovsky so much. I've met him a bunch of times. I go to any event that I can that features him because I love hearing him talk about his fiction and what inspires him. I recently did a full video about why his science fiction is so great, why he is the king of the genre right now, and Shroud is just more proof of his greatness when it comes to science fiction. It's a novel set in the far future where capitalism is the driving force for everything we do. Ships full of engineers and scientists are sent out into the abyss to find planets and moons that might be used for various reasons, most notably resource collecting. One of those moons is nicknamed Shroud because it is veiled in darkness. The surface of this moon never ever sees sunlight. But there is life down there. And when something terrible happens on the ship and there are only 2 survivors, those survivors have to navigate the landscape on Shroud. As they do so, they try to understand the creatures that live on this moon. And the creatures are doing the same thing. Because these humans are just as alien and enigmatic to them as the creatures are to the humans, obviously. This is a pretty horror-tinged sci-fi novel, but it's also kind of a case study of empathy, as is so often the case with Adrian Tchaikovsky's science fiction. God, he's amazing. I'm also continuing my journey of steadily reading all of Brandon Sanderson's books. At the very start of this year, I read Mistborn, the first book in the Mistborn trilogy, a book that used to be called The Final Empire, but now all the copies that I see out in the wild are called Mistborn, and I didn't think about that until recently, but who cares? This is the second book in the trilogy, The Well of Ascension, and I can't really say anything about it because it's the second book in a trilogy. If you haven't read the first one, anything I say about this book is a spoiler, because the first book ends in a very exciting way and the second book continues after that ending. What happens next? Well, what can I say? I literally can't think of anything to say that wouldn't give away what happens in the first book. I'm planning on doing a full review of the trilogy once I've read the third one, which will probably be pretty soon because I am very invested in this trilogy. Sanderson excels at world building. His books are enormous, but they are effortless to read. It is so easy to just glide through his books. He has a way of writing that just makes it a joy to be in this place and follow the story along. Even if nothing happens, there are definitely moments in these books that could have been cut for the sake of brevity and a tighter plot. I am a big fan of pacing. I like stories to move at a consistent click, and his books don't. There are definitely moments where nothing seems to be happening, but I enjoy those moments. Because I'm enjoying being in the world, I enjoy these periods of peace and quiet where characters just kind of sit around and talk. Any author who can pull off that kind of a thing and I don't get annoyed or feel like my time is being wasted is a serious talent. An author who arguably isn't a serious talent is TJ Klune. This is the newest TJ Klune novel, The Bones Beneath My Skin. This copy was sent to me by Tor, and I thought it was okay. I always think his books are just okay. I did a video about the fact that TJ Klune is overhyped and overrated, but there is still one thing about his fiction that I always enjoy. TJ Klune's stories are so paint by numbers. His writing is sometimes a bit cringe because he writes books that feel very YA and then they're full of swearing, almost as if he's being a bit of an edgelord. And the most egregious thing about him is that he walks very, very well-trodden ground, takes themes and ideas and character archetypes and story tropes, everything that you've seen 1,000 times in storytelling before, and he just makes it gay and makes it cozy. And as a queer person, I appreciate good gay literature. But TJ Klune is just so safe. The Bones Beneath My Skin is so safe. It's a story that'll hit you with déjà vu because you've read it before. But the one thing that always has me enjoying his books, in spite of everything I just said, is his character writing. He writes such lovely people. His books are always so dialogue heavy, and I love that dialogue. I always enjoy how his characters interact with each other, what they have to say, what their personalities are like, and how those personalities clash with each other. It is the one huge redeeming thing about TJ Klune is that I love his characters. They are so endearing and sweet and lovely and fun and funny people. So even though there's so much about him I dislike, so much I find tiresome and uninteresting, his characters carry me through his books over and over again because he really knows how to write a lovable cast of enjoyable characters that you like spending time with. Another really, really great fantasy novel that has probably gone under the radar for so many people is The Pariah by Anthony Ryan. Anthony Ryan has written quite a few fantasy books at this point, and I admit I haven't read any of them until now. And The Pariah is the first in a trilogy that is ongoing. I'm pretty sure the second one is now out and the third one is coming soon. And this is a really, really fun work of fantasy fiction. It kind of borders on grimdark, and it is very much focused on its first-person narrator protagonist. And kind of like with TJ Klune, it is the protagonist's lovability that pushes us through the story. It's set in a very grounded, very simple medieval fantasy world with not really any magic to speak of. There is a king and there is a pretender, someone who is vying for the throne, and so there are battles and skirmishes that are breaking out between the king and the pretender. But our protagonist exists on the fringes of all of that. He is part of a band of outlaw criminals who live in an expansive forest. Kind of like Robin Hood, but not so much steal from the rich and give to the poor as just steal from the rich. Our protagonist, Alwyn Scribe, or just Alwyn as he's known at the beginning, has been raised by and remains pretty close to the leader, a man who calls himself the Outlaw King. Alwyn looks up to him and, well, this is given away in the blurb, so I don't feel bad talking about it, but the book is basically split into thirds. And the first third is about the outlaws and what they get up to. But it ends with them setting up a really big plan for something they're about to do, and some kind of betrayal leads to a massacre where so many people are killed and Alwyn manages to escape. From there, he ends up in a prison, and after the prison, he ends up as a soldier. All of this is given away in the blurb. I normally wouldn't give this much away, but it's literally on the back of the book, so. We follow Alwyn's journey from outlaw to prisoner to soldier, and it's really, really compelling. Now, I kicked off this video with the last book that I read this month, so before I get into the comics section, let's talk about the first book that I read this month, Red Sonja Consumed by Gail Simone. This is a fitting point in the video to talk about this because Gail Simone, up until the publication of this book, was exclusively a comic book writer. Gail Simone has written some of my favorite comics ever. Her run on Suicide Squad, her run on Batgirl, these are legendary things. And she also, about 10 years ago now, revitalized the character of Red Sonja in comic books. And Consumed is her debut novel. She has returned to the character and the world of Red Sonja, and she's doing something really cool with it by writing a novel. Now, a lot of people are going to call this book fantasy, and it is, but more specifically, It is a part of the sword and sorcery genre. Sword and sorcery is a kind of subgenre of fantasy created by Robert E. Howard like 100 years ago. Most famously, his Conan the Barbarian books. Sword and sorcery is more pulpy than high fantasy. Rather than focusing on world building, it focuses on a single protagonist on a quest of vengeance. That protagonist is usually an anti-hero who doesn't mind getting their hands bloody. They're usually a pretty unlikable person. And the whole tone of Sword and Sorcery is very campy, very pulpy, very fun. Red Sonja Consumed is a return to that style of fantasy fiction. Not the kind of thing you see very often these days. And so I really appreciate what Gail Simone has done here, especially because that was a genre that was dominated by men writing about women in skimpy bikinis. Now we have a woman doing that and doing it justice, and it's so much fun. Do not sleep on this book. You don't need to have read any of the comics, just go in, read this book, and have a blast. And finally, let's talk about comic books, because I've got something really awesome to show you here. This is a brand new world called Ghost Machine. See, the two largest companies when it comes to comic books are Marvel and DC. So many of the stories that we read are about the superheroes in the Marvel and DC universes. But just recently, Jeff Johns, a veteran comic book writer who spent like 10 years writing The Flash, and then another 10 years writing Green Lantern, he went off to Hollywood to write some of the film scripts for those terrible DC movies that nobody liked. Then he came back to comic books to create an entirely new universe of characters. This universe is called Ghost Machine. And these are all brand new original stories in that universe. A lot of them are written by Jeff Johns and some of them aren't. It's not often you get an entirely new universe of superheroes. And it all kicks off with Geiger, written by Jeff Johns and drawn by Gary Frank. Jeff Johns and Gary Frank have done some amazing work together, especially on Superman, and seeing them doing something new and original here is really cool. Geiger is a very grimdark post-apocalyptic story. It's set a few decades from now, after a massive nuclear war. Las Vegas is ruled by a teenager in a suit of armor, and living just outside Vegas in the Nevada desert is a glowing man. A man who doesn't need a radiation suit. A man who sits outside of a bunker and keeps it safe. Why? Well, just as the bombs started to fall, he and his family ran to take cover in their bunker, but he didn't make it. His wife and kids are in that bunker. They have been for decades. And he sits outside the bunker, glowing with radiation, watching over his family. Now, the Ghost Machine universe is set in like an alternate history. Some of it is set in the future, some of it in the present, some of it in the past. And one element of Ghost Machine is a kind of horror series called Hyde Street. And this is a one-shot comic set in the Hyde Street universe of the Ghost Machine universe. It's a brand new universe and I'm already getting confused. As far as I understand, Hyde Street is kind of like the Twilight Zone, where there are lots of individual, creepy, weird, sci-fi inspired stories. And this single story is called Devour. It was written by Maytal Jute. I read it in like 15 minutes. And it tells the story of 3 generations of women who are all obsessed with their weight and their body image. The eldest of these 3 generations, the grandmother, back in the 80s, was handed a kind of weight loss drug. And from that moment on, for decades and decades, she has been stick thin. She gave the drug to her daughter, who is now urging her daughter to take it because she's about to get married and she wants her daughter to look really pretty in her dress. It's all very toxic. But what exactly is this drug? What does it do? Well, it's a trip. It is something else. This is revolting, and I loved it. Another horror story set in the Ghost Machine world is The Blizzard. This was also written by Jeff Johns, and it was drawn by Andrea Muti, someone who I am not familiar with at all, but the art is gorgeous. This is a pretty short, self-contained book, and it follows the tragic story of a man who killed the man who killed his child. There was this monster of a guy who was kidnapping and killing children, and our protagonist snapped on the courtroom steps just as he was on his way to face judgment, and he killed him. Now he's on his way to prison, and the prison bus travels over a mountain. A blizzard hits, the bus crashes, and all of these inmates and their prison guards are now in this forest in a blizzard, and there is a monster out to get them. But the monster is not what you expect. It seems to be picking and choosing who it kills. Why? Well, you have to read to find out. Finally, I'm going to spend like 10 seconds on this one. I am continuing to read Tom Taylor and Bruno Redondo's Nightwing. This is the 4th volume of Nightwing, and it features the 100th issue since the relaunch of all the DC stuff, which they do all the time. This continues to be a wonderful series, and at this point, I kind of prefer Nightwing to Batman. That's the power of Tom Taylor's writing. That is everything that I read in February. I desperately need to deal with my cat and get some water because my voice is hoarse and I'm having a moment. All the videos that I thought I had time to do in February and it turned out I didn't are coming next week, I guess. Look forward to those. Not that I've told you what they are, but they're going to be good. Once again, if you enjoy my videos, if you love my content, if you want to support me, you can do so by joining my Patreon. Your support would mean everything to me. With my Patreon support, I can pay my bills and continue to do what I do here on this channel, which is the best job in the world. And it's only the best job in the world because of the support of my patrons. Thank you so much to them, as always. If you'd like to support me, $1 a month can change everything. Thank you in advance and subscribe for books.